ask you to think about holiness, what's the first thing that pops in your mind? We all have pictures that come into our mind when we think about holiness. Of course, I asked Lori last night, and she said, your socks. Probably wasn't the response that I was looking for, but my mind kind of tends to go towards, for some reason, growing up Catholic, my mind tends to go towards like Franciscan monks with the funny haircut and the robes. And, you know, some people apparently might think about Moses and the Ten Commandments, like portrayed in the movie, or maybe a preacher in a three-piece suit just acting all holy, or somebody who's fasting and praying all the time, or somebody that has no sense of humor. They might be somebody who's holy, or somebody who's very humble, or somebody who shuns all type of fun. We all have a different concept of what holy is. But the question I want you to think about is, do you see holy when you look in the mirror? God has called us to be holy. 1 Peter 1:14-16 says, as obedient children, do not be conformed to the passions of your former ignorance. But as he who called you is holy, you also be holy in your conduct. Since it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. And so as we look at our passage today, we can see that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego demonstrated holiness in their actions and their behavior. We're going to finish up chapter 3 of Daniel this morning. And so just a recap of what was going on. Nebuchadnezzar built an image of gold, 90 feet high, 6 feet wide. It was on a 6-mile plain, so you could see it from all over. Just a real bright, shiny gold thing that stuck up in the air. Some believe it might have been in the image of a person, or some believe an obelisk, or nobody knows exactly what it was, but all we know is it was 90 feet high, 6 feet wide, and it was a magnificent image. And so he called everybody together, and he expected them, when the bells rang, they all had to bow down to him. And so when the bells rang, 3 guys chose not to bow down. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow down. And so then we seen that some tattletales went running to Nebuchadnezzar. And, oh, King Nebuchadnezzar, these guys that you put in place, they didn't bow down. So Nebuchadnezzar brings them back up and says, hey, I'm going to give you a second chance. Will you bow down? When the bells ring, will you bow down? And their response was not what he wanted to hear. Their response basically boiled down to, we don't have to answer you. We're not going to bow down, plain and simple. We will not defile our God by bowing down to another idol. And so what we're going to look at this morning, we're going to look at 3 parts. We're going to look at the consequences to that response. First thing we're going to see is Nebuchadnezzar's response in verses 3:19-23. The Nebuchadnezzar was filled with fury, and the expression of his face was changed against Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. He ordered the furnace heated 7 times more than it was usually heated, and he ordered some of the mighty men of his army to bind Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego and cast them into the burning fiery furnace. Then these men were bound in their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and their other garments, and they were thrown into the burning fiery furnace. Because the king's order were so urgent, and the furnace overheated, the flame of the fire killed those men who had took up Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, fell bound into the burning fiery furnace. So do you think maybe Nebuchadnezzar was just a little bit mad? When you look at this, it says he was filled with fury. The expression on his face was changed. Have you ever had it so you got so mad that the expression on your face was changed? If you're a parent, I'm pretty sure you probably have. I know my kids can do it to me. You just get mad, your face gets all twisted up. He got so mad, he ordered the furnace to be 7 times hotter than normal. And if you think about it, he was doing something outside of common sense. I mean, why would you have the furnace heated 7 times hotter other than you want them to really burn, right? Except for if you're wanting to torture them, well, by having it hotter, that's just going to speed the process up. If you really want to torture him, wouldn't you lower the heat? That way it hurt longer. But no, he had that heated 7 times hotter, and he ordered these 3 boys to go in fully clothed. Now understand, they were dressed to the hilt. They were trying to conform to what Nebuchadnezzar wanted by going to this ceremony. They had their cloaks, their tunics, their hats, and everything else. I mean, they had all this different stuff, all this garb on, dressed up in order to honor the king, and he throws them in with all of that. All of that should really burn quick, right? He didn't seem to care about the safety of anybody else. He had it burning so hot that the mighty men that he had that took these 3 boys up, they got burned up. He was mad. He was clearly mad. But why? Why was he mad? What did they actually do wrong other than not conform? He was upset because things weren't going the way he thought they ought to go. He's kind of like the little kid on the playground that brought his ball to the playground, and when things aren't going his way, well, I'm going to take my ball and go home, and nobody else can play. Doesn't he seem like a spoiled little brat? You understand, this is not an isolated case in Scripture. When people don't do what the world wants us to do, the world tends to get mad. And it started right away in Genesis 4, 5 through 8. I want to look at Cain and Abel for a minute. It says, but Cain and his offering had no regard. God had no regard. So Cain was very angry, and his face fell. And the Lord said to Cain, why are you angry, and why is your face fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is contrary to you. But you must rule over it. Why did Cain get mad? Abel didn't do anything to Cain, but Cain's offering was not accepted, so Cain got very angry. But Cain's heart was not in the right place. God had clearly told him, if you do well, it'll be accepted. But if you don't, sin's crouching at your door. And we all know how that worked out. We know what happens in verse 8, don't we? Cain spoke to Abel, his brother, and when they were in the field, Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him. Cain got so mad that he killed his own brother, all because he didn't have the right heart towards God. We see another situation. We had looked at this a few weeks back, but I want to revisit it again. Saul and David, verses 7, 1 Samuel 18:7 starts out. And the women sang to one another as they celebrated, Saul has struck down his thousands, and David his 10,000s. And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. He said, they have ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they have ascribed thousands. And what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David from that day on. Why was Saul mad? Because they were celebrating David. They had lifted David up before him. What did David do wrong? David didn't do anything wrong, but Saul was mad. And what was the results of that one? We see in verse 10, then the next day a harmful spirit from God rushed upon Saul, and he raved within his house while David was playing the lyre as he did day by day. Saul had his spear in his hand, and Saul hurled the spear, for he thought, I will pin David to the wall. But David evaded him twice. And we know when we read through Samuel, David spent the rest of his days trying to hunt down, or Saul spent the rest of his days trying to hunt down David. David didn't do anything wrong. We can see again in Esther, chapter 3, verses 5 and 6. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down and pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. What did Mordecai do that Haman was very furious? all he did was not bow down to him. Mordecai didn't get the praise that he thought Haman didn't get the praise that he thought he deserved, and so he was mad at Mordecai, so much so that not only did he want to kill Mordecai, he wanted to kill all of Mordecai's people. You know, all of this kind of reminds me of the ad that was in the paper. It says, wedding dress for sale, never worn. We'll trade for .38 caliber pistol. People get upset and do stupid things. But as you look at these biblical examples, what's one thing that they all have in common? All three of these examples, well, and four counting Nebuchadnezzar, is you had somebody that was being obedient to God and somebody bothered because they weren't. You understand, this tells us that there is a pattern in Scripture that if you're standing on God's Word, if you're obedient to God, people might get upset. Don't worry about it. It doesn't matter. They're miserable anyway without Christ, and you know what they say, misery loves company. Our purpose is not to be concerned of whether they get upset or not. And I'm not saying that we purposely go out there and upset people. I'm saying our main focus needs to be obedience to Christ. Our concern needs to be our obedience, period. Not worried about how we might affect somebody else, how somebody else might get mad. Pattern in his Scripture shows that people get mad when people are obedient to God. Peter and John offended the Sanhedrin by preaching about Jesus. They got arrested because of it. And they were told not to preach Jesus' name anymore. Here was their response. Acts 4:19 and 20. But Peter and John answered them, whether it is right in the sight of God to listen to you rather than God, you must judge. For we cannot but speak what we have seen and heard. But you know, they didn't want to offend anybody, so they quit preaching Jesus, right? Is that what happened? We all know better. We see a little bit later, they got arrested again for the exact same thing. They got saved by an angel in Acts 5:19, and then when we jump down to verse 28 and 29, they went out, started preaching in the portico, and Sanhedrin wanted to have them arrested again. The guards came, took them back. The guards were even afraid of them because how'd they get out of the jail? And basically they started to berate them, saying, we strictly charge you not to teach in this name. Yet here you have filled Jerusalem with your teaching, and you have intended to bring this man's blood upon us. But Peter and the apostles answered, we must obey God rather than men. What was their main concern? Their main concern is obeying God, not being worried about what other people might think. They wasn't concerned about keeping the Sanhedrin happy. They were concerned about keeping God happy. So my first challenge to you is don't let the response of others detour you from your obligations to be obedient to Christ. The next thing we can see is the reality of it. Verses 24 and 25. Then King Nebuchadnezzar was astonished and rose up in haste. He declared to his counselors, did we not cast 3 men bound into the fire? They answered and said to the king, true, O king. He answered and said, but I see 4 men unbound, walking in the midst of the fire, and they are not hurt. And the appearance of the 4th is like the Son of God. So Nebuchadnezzar, in his rage, did something really stupid. He took 3 of his best advisors, because they didn't bow down to him, and he tried to have them burned. He had them thrown into the fire, had them killed. I don't think he got the satisfaction he was looking for. I don't think things went according to the way he thought they were going to. They didn't go according to plan. He looks into the fire, and not only does he see 3 guys, he sees 4. And they weren't bound up like they were when they got thrown in there. And they were not laying on the bottom of an ash pile like you would think 3 guys that burn up would be. They were sitting there walking around. They seen a 4th person that looks like the Son of God. So understand, Nebuchadnezzar, being a pagan, was not saying that it was God, or he just seen something that looked like the Son of God. In verse 28, he refers to it as an angel. And so basically, he's seen an angelic being. And a lot of people will tell you that it's possible that that was a pre-incarnate Christ, and it very well may have been. We don't know whether it was a pre-incarnate Christ. We don't know whether it was an angel. We don't know any of those, but reality is it doesn't matter. What matters is God protected these boys. God sent somebody to protect them. And so, as Nebuchadnezzar looks in there, he's basically asked his counselors, didn't we send 3 guys in there? And they're like, yeah. He says, but I see 4, and they're walking around. Now remember, what was the thing that, if you weren't here late the last 2 weeks ago, you wouldn't remember, but 2 weeks ago, the last thing Nebuchadnezzar said before when he gave him this second chance, he said, who is this? He said, who is the God who will deliver you out of my hands? A little bit of an arrogant statement, right? I think he figured it out now, didn't he? God showed him who he was. God showed him what he was capable of. The question is, do we see God that way? Do we see God as able to protect us? Do we realize that God is always protecting us? We need to trust God. You know, we worry about so many things so often, not allowing God to take care of us. Most of the things we worry about never come to pass anyway. When we're worried, basically we're saying that we don't trust the promises of God. Hebrews 13, 5 and 6 tells us, keep your life free from love of money, and be content with what you have, for he has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. So we can confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not fear. What can man do to me? We need to have the attitude that the boys had going in, that our God is able to deliver us. Now understand, they had a but if not clause, because sometimes God allows us to suffer. Sometimes our suffering is what glorifies him the most, because it allows us to get to a point that maybe we can see things from a different perspective, or maybe we can minister to somebody later. So we need to have that but if not, because sometimes God allows us to be thrown into the fire, the same as he allowed them to be thrown in the fire. But God is able to protect us, and we need to know that and understand that. I'm guessing a lot of times we don't realize how often we're being protected. A long time ago, I heard a story. I was listening to Chuck Swindoll preach, and this story kind of stuck with me. Basically, I had to look it up this week. Chuck Swindoll, one of his mentors told him this story about a missionary who was on furlough, and he was driving to the next church, and it was going to be a long drive. He was going to have to drive all night. And so he asked God to help him stay awake, to make it safely to his next engagement, right? Shortly after that, he come across a guy hitchhiking. So he pulls over, and he says he wasn't normally the type that would pick up a hitchhiker, but he just it was pouring down rain, so he felt sorry for the guy out in the rain, so he pulled over and he picked him up. And so after he picked him up, the two of them began to visit, and the missionary figured out that this guy was a believer. And not only was he a believer, they knew a lot of the same people, and they had worked with a lot of the same people in ministry. And so they just had a really, really good conversation. They went on their trip, and the evening went really good. It went very quick. He never got tired at all. And finally they got to where the hitchhiker was going, and he said, well, this is my stop. And the missionary was so excited, he goes, well, why don't we go in and have a cup of coffee? So they go in and have a cup of coffee, and by this point it had stopped raining. And so the missionary ends up, and he leaves, and he gets about a block down the road and realizes, well, I never got that guy's name or number. So he turns back around, and he goes back to the restaurant, or to the coffee shop, and the guy was nowhere around. So he goes in, and he asks the cook, he sees the cook there, and he says, hey, did you happen to see which way that guy went? And he goes, what guy? He said, you come in here alone. He said, I thought it was weird that you ordered 2 cups of coffee. The guy looks over, and the table they were sitting at was a cup of coffee sitting there, still full, but it was cold. And as he went back out to his car, he got to thinking, you know, when I picked that guy up, it was pouring rain. He got in my car. He didn't have a drop of water on him. It struck me so much when I heard that story because Lori had had something similar not that long before. Long time ago, I think it was shortly after we were married, but I bought a truck and I really liked my truck. It was a nice little S10 pickup, a gold pickup, had the rally rims and everything. And Lori was on her way to work one day and she hit a patch of ice and that truck went flipping over into the ditch. The only thing salvageable on that truck was the passenger door. Everything else was dented up. She got thrown from the vehicle. And about a quarter mile away was a house. And somehow, Lori ended up at that house. She does not remember this. Not only did Lori end up at the house, but there was a fenced-in yard in front of the door that had a supposedly very mean dog that never let anybody through. And here Lori's knocking on the door. The guy had said that he had heard the crash. And by the time he got his pants on, Lori was knocking on the door. She claims that somebody in a van stopped and picked her up, and he had to go to the airport, so he had to take off. Nobody ever seen this guy. How did she get there that quick? I'm not going to say that it was an angel that helped Lori, or that there was an angel at that coffee shop with that guy, but I'm not going to say it wasn't either. Because I think there is a lot more spiritual influence that goes on around us than what we realize. Scripture would indicate that we're being protected by angels a lot. And I'm not going to say that we have guardian angels, but I do believe that we're being watched and protected. And so I want to rattle through 5 scriptures real quick that indicate this. Psalm 34:7 says, "The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them." Kind of straight to the point. Psalm 91 is a psalm that talks about God protecting his people. And we can see that the enemy took this out of context. We might remember part of this when he was tempting Jesus. But Psalm 31, when we look at 9 through 13, it says, "Because you have made me the Lord, your dwelling place, the Most High, who is my refuge. No evil shall be allowed to befall you. No plague come near your tent. For I will command his angels concerning you to guard you in all your ways. On their hands they will bear you up, lest you strike your foot against a stone. You will on the lion and the adder, tread on the lion and the adder. The young lion and the serpent you will trample underfoot." And so it says here that he will send the angels to protect us, to guard us. We can see Jesus said, before he talked about the parable of the lost sheep in Matthew 18:10, it says, See that you do not despise one of these little ones. For I tell you that in heaven their angels always see the face of my Father who is in heaven. And so it says that they have angels that are seeking the face of the Father. And the way I understood it in the commentaries that I read on this, basically, somebody messes one of these little ones, they'll be looking at the Father will send them to protect them. Then we see in Hebrews 1:14, the writer of Hebrews was talking about Jesus not being an angel, being above the angels, and he says, to which of the angels did he say, come and sit at my right hand? And then referring to the angels in verse 14, he says, are they not all ministering spirits sent out to serve for the sake of those who are to inherit salvation? Now, who are those that are to inherit salvation other than the believers? And not only that, but we've seen an angel in action in Acts 5:19, but then we also see the same thing happen in Acts 12:6 through 11. Now, when Herod was about to bring him out on that very night, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and sentries before the door were guarding the prison. And before an angel of the Lord stood next to him, and a light shone on the cell. He struck Peter on the side and woke him, saying, "Get up quickly." And the chains fell off his hands. And the angel said to him, "Dress yourself and put on your sandals." And he did so. And he said to him, "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me." And he went out and followed him. He did not know that what was being done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. When they had passed the first and the second guard, they came to the iron gate leading to the city, into the city. It opened for them of its own accord, and they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel left him. When Peter came to himself, he said, "Now I am sure that the Lord has sent his angel and rescued me and from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." Knowing the promises of God, knowing what we have seen Scripture says, knowing that each and every one of us here, I'd be pretty sure every one of us here, has seen answered prayer, why would we ever doubt that God's protecting us? And so my second challenge to you this week is know without a shadow of a doubt that God's watching over you and protecting you. The third thing we can see here is the retrieval in verses 26 and 27. Then Nebuchadnezzar came near to the door of the burning fiery furnace. He declared, "Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, come out and come here." Then Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego came out from the fire, and the satraps, the prefects, the governors, and the king's counselors gathered together and saw that the fire had not had any power over the bodies of those men. The hair of their heads was not singed, their cloaks were not harmed, and no smell of fire had come upon them. God has clearly shown Nebuchadnezzar who he is and what he is capable of. And Nebuchadnezzar calls out to these boys, and he calls them servants of the Most High God. And all of their accusers, all the little tattletales that wanted to see him get in trouble, they're all there to see all of this. These boys were not burnt. There's no evidence that they'd even been in a fire. And he even goes so far as to point out that there wasn't even a smell on them. Now, I don't know how many of you remember when you could go into a restaurant, when you could smoke in a restaurant, and you walk into that restaurant, you walk out smelling like smoke, right? These boys were in a fire, and there was not even a smell on them. It seems that Nebuchadnezzar's attitude changed a little bit after he realized he couldn't hurt him, doesn't it? These boys stood for God. They stood on their principles. They didn't let the threat of even their life deter them. And what happened? Nebuchadnezzar's attitude changed. They set the example, just like we're supposed to set the example. Paul tells Timothy to set the example because, people looked at Timothy because he was young. Basically, Paul told him, just because you're young doesn't mean you don't stand for the truth. He says in 1 Timothy 4, 11 and 12, "Command and teach these things. Let no one despise you for your youth, but set the believers an example in speech, in conduct, in love, in faith, in purity." They set the example, and look what it did for Nebuchadnezzar. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego set the example of how they're supposed to behave. And Nebuchadnezzar's attitude changed. I was reading this week and I come across the story of Harry Winston. Harry Winston was a diamond dealer. And he had heard that there was this wealthy Dutch merchant that wanted a specific type of diamond. So he called the guy and told him, "I believe I have a diamond that you're looking for." And the guy flew from over there over to New York. And Winston had arranged for his top salesman to pick the guy up and show him the diamond. And so when they got to the shop, the salesman's pointing all the technical features of the diamond out to this Dutchman. And the guy kind of looks at it and, he says, "It's a really nice diamond, but I just don't think it's exactly what I'm looking for." And Winston says, "Well, would you mind if I present the diamond to you?" And the guy's like, "Yeah, go ahead." About halfway into Winston's presentation, the Dutch merchant decides, he has a change of heart and he really wants this diamond. And so as they're wrapping the diamond up, the merchant basically asks him, why is it? He says, I felt compelled to buy the diamond from you, but I didn't have a bit of problem telling your salesman no. And Winston's reply was this. He said, my salesman is one of the best in the business. He actually knows more about diamonds than I do, but he lacks one thing. That is the difference between him and I. The salesman knows diamonds. I love them. If we love something, it comes out in our personality. It comes out in what we do. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego loved God, and it showed. You know, they were not about to bow to some idol and ruin that demonstration of love, even if it meant their life. I think the same thing is true for our Christian identity. A lot of people say that they know Christ. But how many people actually love Christ? How many people demonstrate it with their actions? You know, we all know John 14:15 says, if you love me, keep my commandments, right? So we're supposed to keep God's commandments. But do we do that joyfully? What is our attitude on sin? Does it bother us when we sin? Or do we just think, oh, it doesn't matter, God's going to forgive us anyway? If we have that attitude, we're not showing love. We're not demonstrating that love. 1 John 5:3-5 tells us similar. It says, for this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments. And he goes on, and his commandments are not burdensome. For everyone who has been born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory he has overcome the world, our faith. Who is it that overcomes the world except the one who believes that Jesus is the Son of God? Basically, if we truly love God, we're going to want to do what he wants us to do. It's going to come out in our personality. It's going to be what we demonstrate in our everyday life. Everything that we do. People are going to see Christ in us because we're setting that example. We should want to share our joy with others. And so my third challenge for you is to love Christ in such a way that that love is visible and it pours out of you. What do you think that effect that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's actions had for an effect on everybody that witnessed it? Do you think there was any effect whatsoever? I was going to make this a fourth point and call it the reverence. And then I got to thinking about it, and the ending of this chapter is the same ending as chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, or chapter 4, chapter 5, and chapter 6. Every one of the first 6 chapters of Daniel comes to the same conclusion. People obeyed God, and they got blessed for it, because God blesses obedience, right? They get promoted. Daniel gets promoted. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get promoted. When you do what God has called you to do, you get blessed because of it. And so, rather than make another point out of it, we're just going to look at this passage a little bit and close out. So let's look at 28 and 30. Nebuchadnezzar answered and said, blessed be the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and delivered his servants who trusted in him, and set aside the king's command, and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Therefore I make a decree. Any people, nation, or language that speaks anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego shall be torn limb from limb, and their house laid in ruins. For there is no other God who is able to rescue in this way. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. So they clearly got Nebuchadnezzar's attention by their demonstration of their love for God. Understand, Nebuchadnezzar did not fully, completely put God as the God. But he did see what they did and realize that, Nebuchadnezzar had a pantheon of gods. He had all kinds of gods he worshiped. But he put Shadrach and Meshach and Abednego's God above the rest of them. He may not have been, it may not have been his God. He referred to him as the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, but he acknowledged their deliverance by what he called an angel. He acknowledged that they actually had something to have faith in. He acknowledged their obedience to their God. And he clearly wants their God on his side. So much so that he declares that if anybody says anything bad about this God, we want this God on our side. So if you say anything bad about him, you're going to be killed, your family's going to be killed, and your house is going to be in rubble. I'm pretty sure that would probably deter most of the tattletales from saying anything bad about Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego's God again. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not do anything to tell them what to do. Nebuchadnezzar did that by seeing their faith. Basically, I think the key to all of this is verse 28. It's the second half of 28. It says, who trusted in him and set aside the king's command and yielded up their bodies rather than serve and worship any god except their own God. Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged God because these three guys basically followed Romans 12, 1 and 2 long before it was ever written. We all know Romans 12, 1 and 2, right? And if we don't, this is something that we should strive for. Romans 12, 1 and 2 says, I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that by testing you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and acceptable and perfect. These three men lived this verse out. They put their body up as a living sacrifice. They were not conformed by their world. Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged God because these three men decided to be holy. Chuck Colson defines holiness. He says, holiness is the everyday business of every Christian. It evidences itself in the decisions we make and the things we do, hour by hour, day by day. When you look in the mirror, do you see holiness? Because as Christians, we are supposed to be an example of holiness. The question is, are we a good example or not?